All right, so as I mentioned, we're starting a mini series over the return from exile. Originally this was going to be 2 lessons, but then I forgot that Esther is one of the, I guess, post-exilic books. I thought, yeah, we probably should talk about her as well. And luckily, Ezra and Nehemiah were once one book together, and so it makes it really easy just to go straight through both. And so we're going to be talking about Ezra and Nehemiah this evening. As we have been talking about and trying to include, there's a map every week. This week we actually have 2, because this was the Babylonian Empire up until Persians come and attack Babylon, and Babylon falls in 539 BC. And that's when the Persian Empire takes over. And so what we see is Persia was divided into 5-ish groups. You have the main part, which is, of course, named Persia. But then you have Media, Lydia, Neo-Babylonia, and Egypt. And the Persians came through and conquered them all. And in 539, they conquer Babylon. And it then begins the process of, there's all these exiled Jews who are living in Babylon. They don't want to be here. We don't really want them here. Yeah, they can go back and live in Judah or Judea. Point of reference, this is when this area becomes Judea and not just Judah. It's one of those. I know for the past couple of weeks I've been really struggling on what to call the people of Judah, because they're Jews, but that's only a title that's given to them after they become Judea. And so it's one of those. I don't know about you guys. You may not have ever thought about this ever. That's fine. But it's something worth noting that some of these different changes in how people are referenced. But we'll go ahead and get into it. Cyrus is the emperor of Persia. Quick note, going back to last week. Last week, Persia was in one of the visions of Daniel was seen as a ram. It seems kind of weird because it's just a normal animal. It's not one of those, because the ram's fighting a goat with 4 horns, and one of them breaks and splinters, and really confusing stuff, especially to be fighting just a normal ram in the vision. But part of the reason why, at least for me, that kind of makes sense is the Persians had helmets that were more rounded, as you see here. And so I think that's possibly some of the things that we see why they can be associated with rams, because Persia is not considered like their imagery was not a ram. Their flag was not, oh yeah, we have a ram like the United States has a bald eagle. It was a weird man eagle thing that I'm sure you've seen a picture of it, you just didn't know what it was, and so you just kept going on. But that was Persia, and that was what they are. And so the ram imagery, I know I'm going on about ram imagery, which is whatever. I think comes from this idea of, their soldiers wore a rounded helmet that makes them headstrong and more like a ram. But then again, Greece was a goat, so what does that mean? But we're not talking about Daniel. We're talking about Ezra and Nehemiah. Just as a quick overview of some of the chapters, the first couple of sections, there's 3 main ones, just because there's 3 main returning groups. In red, you have the return led by Zerubbabel, which we'll talk about here in a second. But then you have in blue the return of the people led by Ezra. And then you have in purple the return of Nehemiah. And as I mentioned already, Ezra and Nehemiah used to just be one book, and then we decided to divide it in 2. It's somewhat arbitrary, but also not, because, we took just the Nehemiah portion and separated it out from the rest. But there's in these first early sections, there's about 3 parts that goes on. They're sent away by the Persians. And whether it's the Emperor Cyrus or it's the Emperor Artaxerxes, and then there's a goal. What are they trying to accomplish? And then there's a part where they they come up against a challenge and it just kind of fizzles out. So we'll go ahead and talk about Zerubbabel. Zerubbabel, other than being a mouthful of a name to say, he's important for the small effect of he's an heir of David. And you can argue which one, because he's also a forefather of Jesus. And I know it's not great hermeneutics to just guess, but I'm going off on a limb here and saying there's probably only one Zerubbabel of mention, and it's the same guy. But Zerubbabel shows up in both the genealogy that's recorded in Luke and the genealogy that's recorded in Matthew. And I'm noticing now they labeled this one the one of Joseph and that one of Mary, but that one ends with Mary and that one ends with Joseph. So I don't know that's not important to this. But Zerubbabel is that figure. He kind of just shows up very briefly in the line of Jesus. And we can talk about genealogies all day, but or I can. I don't know if you want to listen to that. And so it's one of those, whether we want to argue whatever about Jesus' genealogy, it is worth noting that Zerubbabel shows up in both. And it means he's somewhat significant, even though we've probably never talked about him in Sunday school ever. Little kids don't know the name of Zerubbabel. It's hard for them to say it, but it's just one that we don't bring up a lot. It's not David, it's not Saul. But so Zerubbabel, his goal is we are going to go back and we're going to rebuild the temple. And he's mostly successful. He goes back and he rebuilds the foundation of the temple. And this will happen every time they rebuild the temple. I say every time, it only happens twice so far. But Solomon built his temple and they built a foundation for it. Well, as we saw on Sunday with the end of Jeremiah, the whole city is in ruin. And so they're coming back to a ruined city, and instead of trying to reuse the old foundation, they're laying a new one. We can think to some of the prophecies where it says, the cornerstone you have rejected will become, the stone that you have rejected will become the cornerstone of the new temple. That's, of course, looking to the ultimate temple. But at this point, they have the hope that this will be that temple that has been prophesied, that this is going to be a temple that is prophesied. So they rebuild the altar, they relay the foundations, they clear the Temple Mount, which happens another time. Herod, when he comes to power, this is Herod the Great, he will clear out even more space, and that becomes the foundation of what is currently today the Temple Mount, which has a whole lot more open space than is just being covered by the Dome of the Rock. But I digress. Zerubbabel, his focus again is rebuilding the temple, and it's all going great. It looks like it's going to happen. And then the elders and the people who actually got to see Solomon's temple start griping. I guess not griping. They're complaining. They're lamenting because Zerubbabel rebuilt the temple, but it's not the same. It's not Solomon's temple. It's not one that is ordained with golden ornaments. And even then, they didn't ever see Solomon's temple. They saw a lesser version of Solomon's temple. But they're still looking at the temple that Zerubbabel and his men built, and they're looking at the city of Jerusalem, and they're getting, I guess depressed is a way of saying it. They're lamenting. They're upset. They're sitting there and they're saying, what have we done that we can't even do this right? We followed the instructions. We've done what we thought that was good. But they're still sitting there and they're thinking to themselves, this is not what we set out to build. And then at the end of Zerubbabel's kind of pattern or portion, there's a group of non-exiled Jews or non-exiled Israelites come, and they're described as being adversaries of Zerubbabel. They don't want them to rebuild the temple. And it's not really explained why. in Nehemiah and Ezra, the adversaries are a little bit, when they come, the adversaries have a well-defined reason. With Ezra, it's because they don't want to. Ezra is coming and telling them you need to follow the law of Moses. They don't want to follow the law of Moses. Well, with Nehemiah, it's these basically warlords who are looking around and saying, well, if Jerusalem is rebuilt, well, then we can't bully the people of Jerusalem anymore. We can't have power over them. But these are just adversaries of this attempt to rebuild the temple. You can read into it as, well, they don't want there to be a presence of God in the area because they want to, because again, they fall into the same pattern that we sometimes fall in. Well, God can't see me if I'm not doing the things of God. If I can hide from God. So God can't see me. So especially if we're not having the temple here, well, of course, God can't see me because his house isn't overlooking my plot of land. Again, God does not work with walls and rooms and houses. He can see all of it, and so hiding from him is kind of foolish. Another reason why I skipped this point. Another reason why these older individuals who had seen the temple are lamenting is because the presence of God doesn't ever come to rest in the new temple. It's described in Ezekiel in a vision that God's presence has left the temple. Going back to Solomon, the presence of God is somehow visualized in entering the temple when it's being dedicated. Going back to the tabernacle, the presence of God rests on the tabernacle. It's one of those moments of they're expecting something to happen. They're thinking, well, as soon as we open the doors and we offer the sacrifices, something is going to happen if we did it right. And then they look around and nothing's happened. There is no cloud of smoke that comes to rest in the temple. There's no fire sent down from heaven. There's no booming voice that says, I'm now living here. Thanks for rebuilding my house, guys. It's nothing happens. They just finished a house and they're sitting there. They're lamenting the fact that God hasn't come into the midst of his people. And so they begin to think we've done something wrong, which you could argue, yes, they did, but it's hard for them to see, well, we spent this time rebuilding the temple. That was something we set out to do. We thought it was good. And now it seems like we were being punished for something else. Well, you're being punished because you're part of that generation that had gone into exile because of your sins and the sins of your father. But then, luckily, 60 years pass between then and the next portion, which is when Ezra leads his, return. And under Ezra goes to Artaxerxes. And so Artaxerxes, he'll show up twice, and it's one of those, we can debate which Artaxerxes because there's 4 of them and they're all related to each other and they're back to back to back. And so you can argue which Artaxerxes it is. The Bible just says it's Artaxerxes. And it's the same Artaxerxes in here, and then it's the same in Nehemiah. But the idea is Ezra goes to Artaxerxes and says, I want to go to Judea. I'm going to go not only to rebuild this, the city had kind of come into form. It's not complete ruins anymore. Of course, if you rebuild the temple, you have to rebuild everyone else's houses around it and all the marketplaces and all of this. And Ezra says, I need to go back and lead my people. Ezra had been trained in some way, whether it's traditionally or untraditionally, by those who had used to be priests, used to be the experts of the law. He had some way of knowing the law, and he had heard these stories coming back from Judea, and he's saying, these people aren't following the law, but they have the temple of the Lord. We need to go. Artaxerxes, let me go so that I may teach them the law. And it goes great for a time being. Artaxerxes makes the promise. They lead their return. And Ezra is preaching the law. He's teaching them what they're supposed to be doing. And then he and the elders kind of get off on a tangent. And this idea of you need to re-embrace the law, what you recognize is the people of Judea have begun to intermarry. And So Ezra decides, you know what? We're going to tell every intermarried couple that they need to get a divorce. Because that's what it says in Deuteronomy. Now, the weird part is this never comes from God. This doesn't come from a prophet. There's no voice from heaven saying, Ezra, this is what you're to do. It's just something that the elders and Ezra kind of get off on a tangent about. They start, well, if we're going to hold people to the law, we need to hold them to it. And so they need to be divorced. And so what we see is these people, they're kind of torn up about it. Like, who are you to tell me, one, I'm supposed to be divorced, but also there are prophets still going around. And there, I want to say it's Haggai, who's contemporary of Ezra at this time. And so Haggai is going around and he's telling them, God finds divorce despicable. Like, you are not to get a divorce. We see it with Christ. Christ says there's very few reasons to get a divorce. Divorce is bad. We know all the kind of traditional church talking points. Well, that's what the Jews are hearing at this time too. Ezra's not alone in trying to lead the Jews. And so what we see is Ezra is sitting there, but he's picked his hill that he's going to die on. His hill that he's going to die on is, well, he doesn't die on it because he's still alive in 50 years. But he decides, this is where I'm making my stand. My stand is there are not to be any intermarried couples in Jerusalem. They need to just either divorce and be sent out, or they just need to both leave. And that it's a weird hill to die on. But let's see if I can. We'll do it this way. What we kind of see is there's some hopes. I know I'm skipping to my last slide, but there are some hopes that have kind of been here. Hopes are in blue, red are kind of disappointments, and there's a conclusion purple. But there's a hopes of these people who are coming out of exile. They're hoping for a future messianic king. Well, we saw that Zerubbabel is not that promised Messiah. He's not. He got angry with people who hadn't gone into exile and said, "You are not worthy of being a part of Jerusalem and Judea." There's a promise that God's presence will rest in a new temple. That's not it, and that there will be a kingdom of God over all the nations. Well, Ezra is kind of also, he falls into that third one of, if God's supposed to be king over all these nations, Ezra is really taking the hardline stand of saying the nations have no place in God's kingdom. And so it's kind of one of those disappointing moments of Judea is not this promised kingdom. We thought there might be a chance. It's been 60 years since Zerubbabel made his return. So maybe it's a child of Zerubbabel. It's an offspring of Zerubbabel will be the Messiah. And so maybe what we're doing here will eventually become this promised kingdom. But as it's now 60 years later, and Ezra's saying, yeah, but it's only for the Jews. And that's one of those moments of, I have to rationalize it as this is not the promised kingdom. Judea is not the promised kingdom, which we even see. We'll talk about this more later. I think it's in 2 weeks. We'll talk about it. This is laying that foundational groundwork for some of those ideas held by Sadducees and Pharisees in Jesus' time is, well, this hope of that there's a kingdom, a temple in which all the nations will come and all the people will be invited in open arms. Well, they, instead of remembering that the promise was that it's all the nations, it's to the Jews and the Gentiles from all the corners, they start grasping onto this idea that Ezra has of, no, it's just to the Jews. It's just to those who receive the law. It's just to those who do the right things. And but we can talk about that, or we will talk about that more later. But Ezra makes a mistake, but there's no real conclusion to this. It's just, all right, next on to the next guy, is how it's written. It's a very anticlimactic point, but Zerubbabel's arc or story also carrying to an anticlimactic point. It's just kind of, he got upset. Next. And again with Ezra, he told all these interracial couples, get a divorce. People got upset and left. On to the next. And that will bring us to Nehemiah. Nehemiah, he's not a Jew. He's just some guy who likes the Jews. It's kind of hard to understand what he really is. Some will argue, well, he's not ethnically Jewish. He's not an ethnic Jew. He wasn't a part of a group that had been exiled, but he is somehow either converted or he was born from an interracial couple from Babylon. It's confusing, but all we know is he's a Jew and he's serving in the court of Artaxerxes, or he's not an ethnic Jew. He has some relationship with Judea, and he is serving in the court of Artaxerxes. And he comes to Artaxerxes because he wants to rebuild the walls. I put that on word. He comes to Artaxerxes and he pleads, and because he somehow convinces Artaxerxes, yeah, can you provide the materials for this wall? Can you, like, if you let us build this wall that you pay for, we'll pay you back somehow. Of course, the paying back is via taxes and all that. We can talk about taxes all day, but I don't want to talk about taxes all day. Taxes are boring. But so Nehemiah, he pleads for the king, and the king says, okay, sure. And so you go lead this third group, and you're going to go and you're going to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. And so he sets out with that goal. But first he goes, his first objective is to survey the damage of the walls. Some argue, well, he first started at this point and he was trying to find the water source. He knew where the pool was supposed to be according to old records or whatever. And so he went to go find the pool of Siloam and the Hezekiah's tunnel and where they can get water. And he needs to rebuild that. I don't know why, because it's a big deal what he goes and sees first. I think it was more of just some people like arguing one way or the other for whatever reason, because they like arguing. I think that's a good consideration. But what he does is he surveys the wall. He sees that it's in disrepair, of course, because it's been a conquered city, and they go and they desire to go. He desires to rebuild the well as well. And of course, he widens the tunnels and raises the ceilings and gets men under the ground so the water flows again into the city. And then they begin rebuilding the walls. But as they begin rebuilding the walls, of course, he runs into challenges. What happens is Sanballat and Tobiah and Geshem, which is weird that, at least for me, it's weird to think Sanballat and Tobiah are the names that keep showing up, and then it's, and also Geshem. And so that's a weird point. But these are the warlords, basically. They're not kings, they're not really generals, but they have influence in the region. Whether it's more of a trade guild where they're considered, well, we want our traders to get favorable treatment, so that's what we're going to push for, so we're going to defend them, or if it's more of a raiding party, it's not really super clear. But what we do see is they raise up us. They start cutting off supply lines through the wall, and causes Nehemiah to send notice to Nehemiah sending something to Nehemiah. Nehemiah sends something to Artaxerxes, and Artaxerxes kind of clears everything up, and because there's confusion of, well, why would the emperor of Persia care if Jerusalem has walls? Why would he care, and why would he pay for it? That doesn't sound like what an emperor does. And so he comes into conflict, and it's one of those. Nehemiah gets kind of tricked, kind of not. It's a weird way of thinking about it. he ends up having to take refuge in the temple. And the assumption is if he takes refuge, he's the only reason why the walls are being built. And so if he's preoccupied by having to be in the temple, well, the walls will stop and that will be enough for us to attack. But Nehemiah prays and he does the things that God commands him to do, and the wall construction keeps proceeding as normal. It's kind of like that line from The Office of, it's amazing to think how much adults get done when they don't have a manager interrupting them all the time. And so or it's something like that. But it's that same idea of just because the boss is gone doesn't mean they're stopping what they're doing. But it does come to a point where Sanballat and Tobiah decide the only way we're going to stop the wall being built is if we openly attack. Of course, Nehemiah gets wind of this, and of course, this building of the wall is taking forever because since they built the temple first, which to some was an argument that they did it backwards because, well, you want the walls defended before you build the temple. But since the temple was built, these walls and the stones are supposed to be quarried off elsewhere because there's not supposed to be a sound of a hammer hitting a chisel. That's how it's described, because that's where the temple is. Again, it's a weird rule. It's still just a building, especially because even after, did I say this? So it was 60 years to Ezra, and it's 50 years from Ezra to Nehemiah. So it's been 110 years ago. The presence of the Lord still did not come to rest in the temple in that time. So it's a weird thing, and I don't know. It's just, that's what they decided to do. That's all right. I just don't understand it. And then so they decide we're going to have to move all these stones from somewhere else to the city of Jerusalem and slowly put them in its place. It's taking them a while because they don't have tractors or anything like that to move anything quickly. And so they're slowly putting it together. And as Sanballat and Tobiah come and they're ready to attack, what happens is they're supposed to take shifts. As for every worker, there's a soldier between each worker. The worker is doing nothing but holding a shield and spear, and some of them are with bows and arrows, ready to defend the wall at any moment. Of course, this is one of those kind of surprises to Sanballat and Tobiah, because as they're ready to make their march, they suddenly see, well, these aren't just workers saying here and who have hammers or masonry tools. These are actually warriors ready to defend Jerusalem. Not that you could argue, well, Sanballat and Tobiah have the numbers advantage. Well, sure, but it's no longer the act of surprising the enemy anymore. So they're ready for attack, and they have a defensible position. And then in Nehemiah chapters 8 through 12, what we see is Judea goes through a series of revival. Ezra, who I always thought was an old guy when he leaves, and so for him to still be around 50 years later makes him feel really old. And so I don't know how old I was thinking of him when I thought of Ezra, the book of Ezra, but in Nehemiah he's still around, and he begins reading the Torah amongst the crowds, and it's in that weird. I have a picture somewhere. I'm sure if we wanted to spend time going through my photos, I can pull it up for you guys. But it's there's a small portion right outside the temple, right between the walls. There's this little area, and it's kind of near where David's palace used to be, and it had become a place in which cisterns were, and where you'd pull water out and you'd let it sit and distill, and you'd let the film sink or be skimmed off before taking it back. That's not super important to what it is. It's just describing the location. And they build up kind of the stage, and they're sitting there, and Nehemiah is just kind of standing on stage. I don't know why he's there, other than I guess he's the main character by this point. But he's standing on stage, and Ezra gets up and he's reading the law of Moses. And of course, everything was read back then, and so he's not interjecting his own thoughts, or at least it's not recorded. But he reads the law, and what happens is, I guess this is why Nehemiah is there. Nehemiah is there to call them into a time of renewal. And there's a great response. The people are ready to confess their sins. They make a great confession. They embrace a covenant of renewal. There's a great celebration in Jerusalem. And so there's a big moment we have rebuilt Jerusalem. We can see the walls that we've built. We can see the temple we've rebuilt. We have been brought back together as a people. God is truly with us. Yes, okay. Ezra, I really think that I have, well, you read me the list of the laws, and I think I've broken plenty of these. And so I'm going to confess of this, and I really need to make a commitment to this covenant of renewing myself. And we're going to celebrate. We're going to have the Feast of Booths, which is an 8-day celebration for the first time since the destruction of the temple. We are back. We are finally out of the dark times. We are re-emerging ourselves as God's kingdom. I don't know how long. Some like to say it was a week. Some say it was a day. Some say it was a year. All we know is Nehemiah later on, similar to what he did when he first got to Jerusalem, he comes to a point in chapter 13 where he's surveying Jerusalem one last time. He's kind of effectively become, I guess you could call him the mayor, or at least that's the way it's pointed out. Like, he's the one who's probably in contact with the Persians still. He's in some form of role, both in the sense of religious life, but also in the sense of political life. And he's going on this kind of journey. It's not in the sense of how a king would parade around town. A king would, the guards would go ahead and make way, and there'd be a horse and a chariot and loud noise. And Nehemiah says, I'm just going to survey the city. And what he sees is Judea has slid back into a state of decline. There was just a moment of great strength and renewal in chapters 8 through 12, but in chapter 13, Nehemiah sees Jerusalem in a state of which the temple has become neglected. The priests, yes, there are priests, but they haven't been trained. They haven't been taught everything, and they've become lazy and they've groaned, and they're not doing the things that priests are supposed to be doing. The temple has become neglected. The Sabbath has been dishonored. Ezra spent time teaching the law, both during his time ministering, but he gets off on a tangent. But before that moment, he spends time teaching them the law, teaching them the significance of just the 10 Commandments, let alone the rest of the law of Moses. And we just had a rededication where he read the law, and they are neglecting, at least what seems to be to Nehemiah, the most important part, taking time to be with God in the Sabbath. And then, of course, he gets his feathers probably most rustled because the significance of the walls are ignored. He spent time making sure that these are well-defendable walls. These are walls that are going to last until the next destruction of the city. These are walls that are going to last for generations. And then he walks out to the edge and he sees there's just people outside the walls. What's the point of having walls if you're going to build the city outside the walls? What's the point if you're going to what's the point of keeping foreigners out if you're just letting foreigners sit right outside the gates? What is the point? He gets angry, and then, kind of like the last couple instances, the story just kind of ends. But it's one of those moments where we kind of have to look back, come to the transition between hopes in reality for this return. The hope is that they've heard the prophets, they've heard the words and the teachings have kind of made its way around, and they have these hopes for what will come because it's been promised. God has promised them a Messiah. God has promised them a nation. God has promised them a new temple better than Solomon's, in which his presence will be in them, amongst them, and they're not seeing it. They have this lofty vision. And it's easy for us to say as Christians, well, of course their vision was wrong, because we're just now starting to see some of it in the age of the church. We're not just now seeing the part of the Messiah. There's Christ, but you could argue, well, Christ hasn't come into the fullness of God in his kingdom. He hasn't brought about the end in which the new temple is built. Going back to Ezekiel from last week, there was a new temple that was supposed to be built in a new Jerusalem, a new city in which the nations were supposed to come to, and there's living life breathed out amongst the dead, living water that pours down and redeems even the Dead Sea. That is not what is happening in the time of Ezra and Nehemiah. So their hopes are getting kind of squashed. They're seeing there isn't a presence of God in this temple that we've built. There is no promised Messiah around, and Judea is falling definitely short of the kingdom of God. But the conclusion, it's kind of implied. It's not explicit. But the idea is there's still a people with bad hearts. Not saying that they'll need a cardiologist, but in the fact that their hearts are not in the right place. They're not, in all these things, they're not thinking of deepening their relationship with God. They're not thinking of how what God is telling them to do is something that they should listen to and apply to their lives because it's actually good for them to listen. Rather, what they're hearing is just a set of rules they need to do so that they can be the ones in power. The steps that they're going, if we do all this right, we rebuild the temple the right way, we rebuild the walls the right way, if we follow the law in just the right way, maybe we will find favor in God and God will bring us back to being in power in which we are not oppressed by the Assyrians or the Babylonians or the Persians or the Greeks or the Romans. But that's not what happens. What they need is a new heart. They need a heart that is full of life. There's a heart after the heart of God, something that is understanding and not divisive of forcing intermarried couples to get divorces. That is not the heart of God. That is not representative of what there is supposed to be. And we have talked both on Sunday and even here on Wednesday nights of this idea that God has sent the people into exile to maybe you'll learn a lesson in Babylon. But what we're seeing here is they didn't learn a lesson. They were probably still sitting there kind of like a toddler in timeout. Yeah, they're going to say they learned their lesson, but really they were just waiting until the timer beeped and they could get out. They weren't thinking about what they did wrong. They're not learning their lesson by sitting in the corner. They're just thinking, well, if I count to 60 this many times, the time will be up. And so they just waited their time. They held on to the worst of their beliefs. Yes, they learned, okay, idol worshiping is bad. But they didn't learn the lesson of you are to love God, you are to love your neighbor as yourself. You are to love first and not be divisive. The law is not meant to be rules to follow. It's supposed to be a guide to leading you to God. That's not what they learned. And so we see at the end of this a desire to be that there's still a missing gap. That was a lot quicker than I thought we'd get through, but next week we'll talk about Esther, and so we know where we're going. If you guys have any questions or comments, or Michael, I see you have a public face.
I like your PowerPoint.
Yeah.
Simple.
Thank you.
And I'm glad you're the one having to say all those things.
Yeah, there was, what was I doing? I had some, maybe it was a Devo. But oh, I know what it was. It was, so last Sunday I was substituting in one of the classes, and I said, all right, who wants to read this chapter? And they started off and they're like, all right. And I was like, okay, there's nothing bad here. And then I got to the last like 3 verses and I was like, I should have stopped you like 5 verses ago because I could have read those. And
Yeah.
they're like, and Nebuchadnezzar, and which I struggled with at one point too. I probably still do. I was calling Nehemiah Zerubbabel. I'm struggling with names just as bad, just slightly better than some. But yeah, names are hard. And that's why I think, yeah, it's Zerubbabel is most likely the same as Zerubbabel. Like it's one of those one in a million names. Especially because he was unsuccessful and kind of mean to like the foreigners or just the people who hanged on his exile. No one's naming their kids Zerubbabel.
No one's been that.
Yeah, like we see in Jewish history, like Cyrus is a name that just becomes very Jewish. Like it's a name that Jews even today name their kids after. Why? Because they're naming him after Emperor Cyrus, who freed them from captivity. They're not naming it after Zerubbabel, the guy who kind of rebuilt the temple and then kind of just fizzled out. Like that's not the name that they're remembering. They're remembering names like Moses or Joshua or those names. But yeah, we can talk about genealogies more. Unless Michael, you're really ready for that genealogy.
No,
Okay.
good.
I mean, I would like to see that side
Which side?
for genealogy.
Yeah, I tried to find that on the internet.
I searched genealogy of Jesus, and that's what came up. It was one of them. I don't know what words we need to find. But one thing that's interesting is so Zerubbabel's exodus, I guess we can call it an exodus from Babylon, is only about 50 or 60 years after the initial or the completion of the exile. And so from the last person that Babylon brought in, which is just kind of, I don't know, it's weird because then Zerubbabel's dad is the only, like the next step. It feels like it's a very quick turnaround, which people live to 50. So it's not like weird. It's just weird because a lot of the kings at the end are there for like 10 years, 7 years, 3 years. And so it's just, and then you have one that's 50 and then, oh, now we're back and the exile's over. And so, I don't know, that's just a weird note. Any other questions about the genealogy of Jesus Christ? Or anything we talked about. We don't have to talk about the genealogy. If not, I think we can call it a night. So, all right. Thank you guys for being here. And see you next week. So.